I never liked the silence of the suburbs. It isn't a peaceful silence. It's a heavy silence, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. I was working the graveyard shift at a local archives office, digitizing old property records. It was soul-crushing work, but it paid enough to keep my apartment and my caffeine addiction going. The building was a concrete tomb from the 70s, cold, smelling of ozone and rotting paper. That night, the air felt different, thicker. I was in basement level 3, the only one in the building. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, nauseating frequency that vibrated in my teeth. I had been staring at the same dusty ledger for 3 hours, my eyes burning from the glow of the monitor. Then, I heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a door closing. It was the sound of something, dry, dragging across the floor, like a sheet of old parchment being pulled over sandpaper. I froze. My mouse cursor blinked on the screen, a tiny white heartbeat in the dark. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded thin, fragile. No answer, just the hum of the lights. I told myself it was the ventilation. This building was old. The pipes groaned like dying animals all the time. I turned back to my scanner. I placed the next document down, a property deed from 1924, and pressed the button. The light bar began its slow, mechanical crawl. As the light passed across the glass, I saw a reflection. Behind me, near the heavy steel door of the vault, there was a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow cast by a filing cabinet. It was tall, too tall. It looked like a man stretched out on a rack, his limbs elongated, his head tilted at an angle that should have snapped his neck. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My lungs felt like they had turned to lead. The dragging sound happened again. Closer now. I looked at the monitor. The scan was finishing. The image flickered onto the screen, rendering line by line. But it wasn't the deed from 1924. The scanner had captured something else. It was a picture of the back of M.Y. head, taken from 6 inches away. And in the corner of the image, through the grain and the digital noise, I saw a hand. It didn't have skin. It was wrapped in layers of yellowed, blood-stained medical gauze, the fingers ending in jagged, broken nails that looked like they had been used to claw through concrete. I felt a cold draft on the nape of my neck. "Do you?" A voice whispered. It didn't sound like a human voice. It sounded like 2 dead leaves rubbing together. "Do you have any idea how much it hurts to be forgotten?" I bolted. I didn't grab my bag. I didn't turn off the computer. I just ran. My boots slammed against the linoleum as I scrambled toward the emergency exit. I reached the heavy metal door and slammed my weight against the push bar. It didn't budge. I hit it again and again, shouting now, "Help! Open the door!" I looked back down the long, narrow corridor of filing cabinets. The lights were flickering out, one by one, starting from the far end. Darkness, darkness, and in the brief flashes of light, I saw him, the gauze man. He wasn't running. He was twitching. His body moved in violent, unnatural jerks, covered from head to toe in those filthy, dry bandages. Every time a light went out, he was 10 feet closer. He was by the water cooler. He was at the midway point. He was right in front of me. Up close, the smell hit me. It wasn't just old paper. It was the smell of a reptile house, rotting meat and stagnant water. He leaned in. I could see his eyes through the gaps in the gauze. They weren't eyes. They were just too wet. Black holes filled with a frantic, starving intelligence. "You missed a page," he hissed. He raised a hand, those jagged nails inches from my throat. And then the power cut out completely. Pitch black. I fell to my knees, sobbing, waiting for the cold steel of a blade or the grip of those dead fingers. But nothing happened. I waited for what felt like hours. Slowly, the backup red emergency lights hummed to life, bathing the hallway in a bloody, dim glow. He was gone. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, right where I had been standing, was a single piece of paper. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a map of my apartment. My bedroom was circled in red, and underneath, written in a dark, crusty brown fluid, were the words, "I am coming home." I didn't go home. The map, that horrible stained piece of paper in my hand, it felt like it was radiating heat. My bedroom was circled in red, but the circle wasn't just a mark. It was an incision. Someone had pressed so hard with a pen that the paper was nearly torn through. I spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, sitting in a corner booth where I could see every entrance. Every time the bell above the door chimed, I flinched. Every time a customer walked in wearing a heavy coat, I stopped breathing. I needed to know who he was. The archives weren't just a job. They were a graveyard for things the city wanted to forget. Condemned buildings, closed asylums, police reports from decades ago that never led to an arrest. I opened my laptop, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I still had remote access to the server. I shouldn't have. It was a security risk. But in this job, everyone was lazy. I logged in. My screen flickered, the blue light reflecting in the dark circles under my eyes. I searched for the file I was scanning before it happened. Property deed, 1924, Sector 7G. The file was there, but when I opened it, it was different. The text was being redacted, right in front of my eyes. Thick, black bars were appearing over the sentences, one by one. It looked like someone was painting over the words with digital ink. "Stop," I whispered, but it didn't stop. I scrolled down frantically, trying to read the words before they disappeared forever. Subject, Elias Thorne. Occupation, medical technician. Incident, vault collapse. The black bars caught up. Condition, extensive epidermal loss. Required constant wrapping. My heart stopped. Subject refused to die. Claimed he could hear the paper. Claimed the records were breathing. Then, the screen went white. A single line of text appeared in the center of the blank page. "You are reading my skin." I slammed the laptop shut. I pushed it away from me as if it were a live grenade. The other people in the diner, a tired waitress, a truck driver, they didn't notice. To them, I was just another paranoid soul losing his mind at 4 a.m. But I knew Elias Thorne wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a hallucination. He was a man who had become part of the system. He was made of the very things I was digitizing. He was the dust, the ink, the yellowed gauze of century-old tragedy. And I had brought him into the modern world. I had scanned him, and now he was in the network. I looked out the window. The sun was starting to bleed over the horizon, a sickly, pale orange. I realized then that I couldn't just hide. If he was in the records, if he was the records, he was everywhere. I reached into my pocket and felt the map again. I had to go home, not because I wanted to, but because that map wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. If I didn't face him in my own space, on my own terms, he would just wait. He would wait in the static of my television. He would wait in the printing of my bank statements. He would wait in the fine print of every contract I ever signed. I paid for my coffee, my fingers fumbling with the coins. As I walked out the door, I heard the waitress call out, "Hey, honey, you dropped something." I turned around. She was holding a small, rectangular piece of paper. "It fell out of your pocket," she said, smiling, but her eyes looked empty. I took it. It was a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me, sitting in the diner booth, taken from the perspective of the window I was just looking through. I was staring at my laptop, and sitting in the booth directly behind me was a tall, thin figure, wrapped in yellowed gauze. He had been there the whole time, watching me, waiting for me to finish the story. I stood outside my apartment door for 10 minutes, my key hovering inches from the lock. The hallway of my building felt wrong, not because of magic, but because of the details. The light bulb overhead didn't just flicker. It had been unscrewed just enough to break the circuit. Someone had been here. I finally turned the key. Click. I pushed the door open. My living room was exactly as I had left it. The half-empty coffee mug on the table, the unmade sofa, the pile of bills by the door. But there was a smell. It wasn't ancient. It was chemical. The sharp, stinging scent of industrial-grade bleach and old, damp bandages. I locked the door. I turned every bolt. I even slid the security chain into place. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely guide the metal into the slot. I walked to my workspace. I needed to see if my system had been compromised. If he was just a man, he had to have a way in. I sat down and woke the computer. The screens flared to life. My desktop background was still there, but something was different. There was a new icon on the desktop. A simple folder named 02-14 AM. The exact time I heard the sound in the basement. I opened it. It wasn't a haunted video. It was a series of JPEG files. Photos. The first one was of my car, parked in the garage. The second was of the diner I just left. The third was a photo of my front door, taken from inside the hallway, 10 minutes before I arrived. He wasn't a ghost. He was a stalker, a professional, someone who knew exactly how to stay in the blind spots of the cameras and the mind. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the screen was dead, not out of battery. It had been remotely wiped. A factory reset, triggered from an external source. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't coming from the computer. It was coming from the kitchen. A slow, rhythmic, metallic sound. Clink, clink, clink. Someone was tapping a knife against the radiator. I stood up, my legs feeling like water. I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from my desk, the only weapon I had. "I know you're in here," I shouted. My voice cracked. "I've already called the police. They're on their way." Liar. I was a liar, and he knew it. The tapping stopped. "The police are currently busy with a 3-car pileup on the main highway." A voice came from the shadows of the kitchen. It wasn't a rasping spirit. It was a man's voice. Calm, measured, disturbingly human. I triggered it myself 10 minutes ago. A few well-placed nails on the asphalt, a distracted driver, and the local precinct is understaffed for the next hour. A figure stepped into the light of the living room. He was tall, painfully thin. He was wearing a filthy, yellow tracksuit, but his face and hands were wrapped in surgical gauze. Not because he was a monster, but because of the burns. Deep, red, weeping scars peeked through the gaps in the fabric. He held a long, serrated kitchen knife. "My kitchen knife. Who are you?" I whispered. "You scanned my records, didn't you?" He took a step forward. His boots were covered in the same gray dust from the archives. Elias Thorne, the man who didn't exist in the city planning files. The man whose house was burned down to make room for a shopping mall. Because some clerk, someone like you, decided his deed was lost him. He wasn't a myth. He was a victim of the system who had turned into a predator. I spent 3 years in a burn ward, wrapped in these. He gestured his bandages, waiting for someone to find my file, waiting for justice. But you just digitize the lies. You make the erasure permanent. He raised the knife. The light from my monitors reflected off the steel. "I'm not here to haunt you, kid. I'm here to correct the record." He lunged. I threw the paperweight. It hit him in the shoulder, but he didn't even flinch. He slammed into me, his weight pinning me against the desk. The smell of the bleach was overwhelming now. It was on his breath. It was on his skin. "Let's see," he hissed, pressing the blade against my cheek. "How does it feel to be the one who gets deleted?" I felt the cold sting of the metal breaking my skin. A thin line of warmth began to crawl down my face. I reached back, my fingers searching blindly across the desk until they closed around the heavy metal power strip. The metal power strip was heavy, cold, and exactly what I needed. As the blade of the kitchen knife bit into my cheek, I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat was constricted by a primal, paralyzing fear. I swung the power strip with everything I had left, catching him right on the side of his bandaged head. The sound was dull, a sickening thud, followed by the crackle of plastic breaking. Elias staggered back, his grip on my throat loosening just enough for me to roll off the desk. I hit the floor hard, the air leaving my lungs in a ragged gasp. He didn't fall. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his head tilted at that same unnatural angle. A thin line of dark, real blood began to soak through the yellow gauze near his temple. "That was a mistake," he whispered. He didn't rush me. He was methodical. He blocked the only exit to the hallway, moving with a predatory grace that told me he had done this before. Many times, I scrambled backward, my hands searching the floor for anything else. My fingers closed around a heavy-duty industrial stapler I use for thick archive folders. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice finally breaking through the terror. Elias let out a sound that might have been a laugh, if his throat wasn't filled with scar tissue. "I've survived a house fire, kid. I've survived 3 years of skin grafts, and a system that told me I was dead before my heart even stopped. You think a piece of office equipment is going to stop me?" He lunged again. This time, he didn't go for the kill. He went for my legs. The knife slashed through my jeans, a cold, sharp sting followed by a sudden, blossoming warmth. I fell. My knee hit the hardwood, and I felt the strength drain out of my left leg. He was on top of me in a second. The smell of bleach and sweat was suffocating. "You're not a ghost." "Elias," I wheezed, shoving the stapler against his chest to keep the knife away from my throat. "You're just a broken man, looking for someone to blame." "I don't need to look," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I found you. I watched you for weeks. I saw you, laughing with your coworkers, eating your lunch, while you clicked delete on lives like mine. You didn't even read the names, did you?" He was right. I hadn't. To me, it was just data, just pixels on a screen. I looked at his hands. The gauze was starting to unravel from his wrist. Underneath, the skin was a chaotic map of white and purple keloid scars. He moved the knife, aiming for my eye. I didn't think. I jammed the industrial stapler against his forearm and squeezed the handle. Clack! The heavy steel staple buried itself deep into his muscle. Elias roared, a raw, guttural sound of pure, human agony. He dropped the knife. I didn't wait. I kicked him in the chest with my good leg, sending him sprawling back into the darkness of the kitchen. I dragged myself up, using the desk for support. My leg was screaming in pain, and the blood was already soaking through my sock. I didn't head for the door. He was too close to it. I headed for the balcony. 3rd floor. A long drop, but better than a blade. I threw the glass door open. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow. I stepped out, the wind whipping my hair. "You can't run from the record." Elias screamed from inside the apartment. I looked down. There was a dumpster in the alleyway, overflowing with cardboard boxes from a nearby grocery store. It was a gamble. I heard his heavy, uneven footsteps hitting the balcony's threshold. I didn't look back. I jumped. The fall felt like it lasted a lifetime. Gravity is a cold, indifferent force. And for a split second, as I hung in the air between my balcony and the asphalt, I felt a strange sense of peace. The rushing wind drowned out the sound of Elias's screaming. Then the impact. I didn't hit the dumpster perfectly. I clipped the edge of the metal bin with my shoulder before crashing into a mountain of wet, discarded cardboard. Crunch. The sound of the boxes collapsing saved my life. But the pain was immediate. It wasn't a sharp sting. It was a dull, radiating throb that felt like someone had slammed a sledgehammer into my collarbone. I lay there for a second, staring up at the square of light that was my balcony. A shadow leaned over the railing. Elias. He didn't jump. He stood there, looking down at me, his bandaged head silhouetted against the amber glow of my apartment. He didn't say a word. He just watched. He was waiting to see if I would move. I forced myself to roll out of the boxes. My left leg, already slashed by his knife, buckled the moment it touched the ground. I stifled a groan, biting my lips so hard I tasted copper. I looked around. The alleyway was a maze of shadows and overflowing trash. At the far end, the streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shapes on the brick walls. I reached into my pocket. My hand brushed against something hard and plastic. The stapler. I had jumped with the industrial stapler still gripped in my hand. It was a stupid, instinctive thing. But as I looked at the heavy steel tool, I realized it was the only thing I had left of my old life. I dragged myself toward the mouth of the alley. Every step was a calculated risk. I stayed close to the wall, my fingers tracing the cold, damp bricks. Scrape, scrape. I heard a door open behind me. The heavy steel fire exit of my building. He was coming. He wasn't running. Elias didn't need to run. He knew I was injured. He knew the city was his territory now, because he was the man who knew every blind spot, every condemned basement, and every forgotten crawl space. I reached the street. It was empty. The suburbs at 3 a.m. are a ghost town. No cars. No late-night dog walkers. Just the hum of the transformers on the utility poles. I looked at my leg. The denim of my jeans was black with blood. I needed to pressure the wound, but I didn't have time. I saw an old, beat-up sedan parked half a block away. A glint of light caught my eye. The driver's side window was cracked open. I stumbled toward it, my breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. "Please," I whispered to the cold air. "Please let there be something inside." I reached the car. I peered through the window. No keys in the ignition. But on the passenger seat, there was a heavy, yellow raincoat and a thick, leather-bound notebook. I didn't try to steal the car. I knew I couldn't drive with my leg in this condition. I reached through the gap in the window and grabbed the notebook and the coat. I crawled under the car, just as a pair of boots appeared at the entrance of the alley. They were heavy boots, covered in the gray, alkaline dust of the archives. I held my breath. I pressed my face against the cold, oily asphalt. The boots stopped 5 feet away from the sedan. Elias was standing there. I could hear his breathing, a wet, whistling sound through the gauze. "I can smell the copper. Kid," he said. His voice was low, almost intimate. "You're leaking. You're leaving a trail of your own history on the pavement. You're writing your final chapter, and you don't even know the ending." He began to walk around the car. Slowly, I watched his boots move. Step, drag, step, drag. He was mocking me. He knew I was close. He was playing with his prey, enjoying the fact that for the first time in years, someone was finally paying attention to him. I looked at the notebook I had grabbed. I opened it quietly, the leather creaking slightly. The first page was a list of names. My name was at the bottom, but it wasn't a list of victims. It was a list of auditors. Every name on that list belonged to someone who had worked in the Sector 7G archives over the last 5 years. Beside each name was a date, and beside each date, a single word. Redacted. I realized then, I wasn't the first. I was just the next one on the schedule. Elias Thorne wasn't just a man seeking revenge for a burnt house. He was cleaning the records. He was eliminating everyone who had ever touched his file, everyone who had seen his true identity. The boot stopped right next to my head. I squeezed the stapler. "Found you," Elias whispered. The car groaned as he leaned his weight against the hood. The smell under the car was a suffocating mix of old grease, leaked gasoline, and the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood. My face was pressed against the cold asphalt. I could feel every grain of grit and every shard of broken glass digging into my cheek. Elias was so close that I could hear the dry friction of his bandages as he leaned his weight against the hood of the sedan. The metal groaned under him, the sound vibrating through the chassis and directly into my skull. I looked at the leather-bound notebook in my hand. My fingers were slick with sweat and road grime, making the heavy paper stick to my skin. I managed to flip to the middle of the book, squinting in the dim, orange light that filtered under the car from a distant street lamp. There were diagrams inside, detailed, hand-drawn maps of the archives where I worked. But they weren't just floor plans. They were blueprints of the ventilation shafts, the service tunnels, and the crawl spaces. Places where a man could live for weeks, watching, listening, without ever being seen. He hadn't just broken into the archives the night I saw him. He lived there. He was the ghost in the ventilation, a literal parasite living in the walls of the city's history. I know you're breathing, kid. Elias's voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper that seemed to come from the ground itself. I can hear the rattle in your chest. That fall, it did something to your ribs, didn't it? A hairline fracture. Maybe two. He was right. Every breath felt like a jagged piece of glass was rotating in my lungs. The pain was rhythmic, pulsing with the beat of my heart. I looked at the undercarriage of the car. Just above my head was the fuel line, a thin, rubbery hose that felt soft to the touch. In my other hand, I still gripped the industrial stapler. It was a desperate, suicidal thought. If I punctured the line, if the gasoline hit the hot pavement, but I didn't have a lighter. I had a stapler and a notebook. I had to find another way. I began to crawl toward the rear of the vehicle, inches at a time. My injured leg dragged behind me like a dead weight, leaving a dark, wet smear on the asphalt that looked black in the moonlight. I had to time my movements with the gusting wind or the distant hum of the city. The boots moved. I saw the heavy, dust-covered soles walk toward the back of the car. "You think you're the first one to hide?" Elias asked. He sounded almost bored, like a teacher explaining a simple lesson to a slow student. "The auditor before you, Sarah, she hid in a dumpster. I found her because she couldn't stop her teeth from chattering against each other. The one before her, Mike, he tried to run for the subway. I caught him on the escalator. He stopped at the rear bumper. The system doesn't like loose ends, kid. And right now, you're a very messy loose end." Suddenly, the car began to shake. The suspension screamed as the rear of the sedan was pulled upward. Elias was lifting it. The sheer, terrifying strength of a man who had nothing left but his rage and the adrenaline of the hunt. The tires groaned as they were pulled away from the ground. I reached the rear axle. My fingers closed around the cold, rusted iron handle of an emergency jack that had been left under the car. It was heavy, solid metal. I didn't crawl out. I waited. The car rose higher, exposing me to the open air. I could see the streetlights now. I could see Elias's legs, his yellow tracksuit trousers stained with grease and old blood. He let go. The car slammed back down with a force that made the ground tremble. The shock wave vibrated through my entire body, sending a fresh spike of agony through my injured shoulder. Come out, come out," he sang softly, his voice muffled by the bandages. He knelt down. His face appeared in the gap between the tire and the chassis. The gauze around his eyes was soaked in sweat and yellowed with age. Those dark, hollow pits stared directly into mine. He tightened the skin around the bandages into a terrifying approximation of a smile. "Found you." He reached under the car, his long, bandaged fingers clawing at my jacket, trying to drag me out into the light. I didn't pull away. I lunged forward with everything I had left. I swung the iron jack handle with both hands, using the momentum of his own pull against him. The metal hit him square in the mouth. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet impact that felt heavy in my hands. Elias's head snapped back. He let out a muffled cry of pain as he tumbled backward onto the pavement. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. I scrambled out from under the car, my breath hitching in my throat. My leg gave out almost immediately, and I collapsed onto the cold street. I looked at him. He was lying on his back, his legs splayed. The lower half of his gauze mask was quickly turning a bright, vivid crimson. He was coughing, spraying a fine mist of blood into the air with every breath. But he was already trying to sit up. His fingers were clawing at the asphalt, searching for purchase. He wheezed, the words bubbling through the blood in his throat. "You little rat." I looked down the street. 3 blocks away, the glowing sign of an all-night pharmacy flickered in the dark. It was the only place that might have people. The only place with a phone that worked. I started to move. It wasn't a run. It was a frantic, lopsided crawl. I held the notebook to my chest like a shield, my heart hammering against my cracked ribs. Behind me, I heard the sound of a body dragging itself off the ground. The hunt wasn't over. It had just moved into the light. The neon sign of the pharmacy flickered, a sickly, buzzing green that washed over the empty street. It was the only light for miles that didn't feel like a threat. But as I dragged my body toward it, the distance felt like an ocean. Every time my left foot touched the pavement, a spike of white-hot agony shot up my spine, vibrating in my fractured ribs. I was leaving a dark, erratic trail behind me, a map of my failure. I reached the glass doors. They were locked. Of course they were. It was after 3 a.m. I slammed my good shoulder against the glass. It didn't break. I looked inside. The aisles were empty, the floor polished to a mirror shine. At the back, behind a high plexiglass counter, I saw a flicker of movement. A night pharmacist, a small, middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a white coat. She was counting pills, her movements mechanical and slow. I began to pound on the glass with my fist. "Help!" I screamed, my voice coming out as a ragged, wet cough. "Open the door, please." She didn't look up. Not at first. I pounded harder. I took the iron jack handle, still stained with Elias's blood, and cracked it against the frame of the door. Finally, she turned. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. She walked toward the door with a slow, heavy gait. She didn't open it. She just pointed to the small metal drawer at the side. The night window. We're closed for walk-ins. Her voice came through a tiny, distorted intercom. "Use the window. State your prescription." "I don't have a prescription." I lunged toward the metal drawer, pressing my bloody face against the glass. "There's a man. He's trying to kill me. Call the police. Please, just call them." The woman squinted at me through her thick lenses. She looked at the blood on my face, the torn jeans, the iron bar in my hand. Her expression didn't change. "I can't call the police for disputes, sir. If you're injured, go to the ER. Now, do you want to buy something or not?" I felt a wave of nausea hit me. The system, even here, at the edge of death, I was being met with the same cold, bureaucratic indifference that had created Elias Thorne. "Listen to me," I hissed, my fingers clawing at the metal frame. "His name is Elias Thorne. He was in your records. He's coming, and he's not going to stop at the door." At the mention of the name, the woman froze. Her eyes went wide. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, toward the darkness of a street I had just crawled from. She reached for the phone on the wall, but her hand was shaking so much she knocked the receiver off the hook. "Thorne," she whispered. "The fire. That was 10 years ago. You knew him?" I asked. Hope flared in my chest for a second. "I was the one who processed his insurance claims," she said, her voice trembling. "The city, they told us to flag his file. They said he was difficult. We denied his medication for the burns. We told them the paperwork was lost." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the guilt in her eyes. "We told him he didn't exist." Suddenly, the green neon light outside went dark. Not a flicker. It was cut. The pharmacy was plunged into a dim, red emergency glow. The humming of the refrigerators died. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. I turned around. Elias was standing 10 feet away. He wasn't twitching anymore. He was standing perfectly still. The iron jack had broken his jaw. I could see the way the lower half of his face hung crookedly under the blood-soaked gauze. But his eyes, they were focused, sharp. He held a heavy, industrial-sized pair of bolt cutters in his hands. "The record," he said, the words slurring through his shattered mouth, "must be balanced." He didn't look at me. He looked at the woman behind the glass. "Hello, Martha," he whispered. "I've been waiting for my refill. He stepped forward. He didn't rush. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew the door wouldn't hold. I looked at the iron bar in my hand. I looked at the woman, who was now backed against the wall, clutching a bottle of aspirin like it was a holy relic. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. I was just the catalyst. I was the one who had woken him up by digitizing the very files that prove his suffering was ignored. I reached into the leather notebook I was still holding. I flipped to the very back. There was a photo tucked into a small pocket. It was a picture of a young man, smiling, standing in front of a small, modest house. He looked happy. He looked normal. On the back of the photo, there was a note in a clean, professional hand. Sector 7G, deletion approved. Property cleared for development. No survivors reported. It was signed by the chief archivist, my boss, the man I had worked for 3 years. Elias wasn't just killing auditors. He was following the chain of command, and I was the one holding the evidence that proved his accident was a sanctioned murder. I looked at Elias. I have it. I screamed, holding the photo against the glass so the emergency light caught it. I have the signature, Elias. I have the proof that they knew you were inside. Elias stopped. He looked at the photo. His chest heaved, a wet, whistling sound coming from his lungs. They knew. He asked. The bolt cutters trembled in his grip. They signed off on it, I said, my voice shaking. They didn't lose the files. They HID them. I can help you, Elias. We can take this to the press. We can. Elias let out a sound that wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a hollow, empty moan. He raised the bolt cutters. No, he hissed. There is no we. There is only the fire and the paper. He slammed the cutters against the glass. The sound of the bolt cutters hitting the reinforced glass was like a gunshot in the cramped foyer. A spider web of white fractures bloomed from the point of impact, spreading across the surface like a fast-growing frost. Martha, the pharmacist, didn't move. She stayed frozen against the back wall, her eyes locked on the rhythmic, heavy movement of Elias's chest. She knew. She knew that every denial she had typed into her terminal 10 years ago was now standing on the other side of that glass, demanding a signature in blood. The window, I croaked, grabbing the edge of the night service drawer. Martha, open the internal lock. Now, she looked at me, her face a mask of pure, catatonic terror. She didn't move. Elias raised the cutters again. His movements were slow, burdened by the weight of his injuries, but there was a terrifying inevitability to them. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a machine of retribution that had been winding up for a decade. Clang. Another strike. The glass groaned, the outer layer shedding tiny, diamond-like shards that tinkled onto the linoleum. I looked at the photo in my hand. The signature of my boss, Arthur Vance, stared back at me. It was a clean, elegant A. Vance, the kind of signature that belonged on a Christmas card or a promotion letter, not on a death warrant. I realized then that Vance hadn't just been my boss. He had been my mentor. He was the one who taught me that an archive is only as good as its secrets. I thought he meant protecting privacy. Now I knew he meant burying the evidence of the city's sins. Elias, I shouted, leaning into the night window. Vance is at his estate in Silver Falls. He's the one who authorized the clearing, not this woman, not me. Elias paused. He lowered the bolt cutters, the heavy iron tips resting on the pavement. He turned his head toward me, the blood-soaked gauze peeling away from his jaw. Vance, he repeated. The name seemed to catch in his throat, a dry, jagged sound. The architect. Yes. I pressed on, my heart hammering against my cracked ribs. He kept the original deeds. He didn't destroy them. He kept them as insurance against the developers. If you want the truth, if you want the record to be permanent, you need those originals. I was lying. I didn't know if Vance had kept them, but I knew it was the only way to get Elias away from his pharmacy and away from me. Elias stared at me for a long time. The emergency red light reflected in the black pits of his eyes. He looked down at the photo I was holding against the glass. Then, without a word, he turned. He didn't run. He walked back into the darkness of the street, the bolt cutters dragging behind him, leaving a thin, metallic scrape on the asphalt. I slumped against the door, my strength finally failing. The adrenaline that had been propping me up was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. "Call the police, Martha," I whispered through the glass. For real this time. I didn't wait for her to answer. I knew the police wouldn't get there in time, and I knew that if Elias went to Vance's house, he wouldn't just kill the man. He would burn everything. The deeds, the evidence, the truth. It would all go up in smoke, just like Elias's home 10 years ago. I looked at my injured leg. The bleeding had slowed to a dark, sticky ooze. I took the yellow raincoat I had stolen from the car and ripped a long strip from the bottom. I tied it around my thigh, pulling the knot tight until I saw spots in my vision. I had to get to Silver Falls first. I looked at the pharmacy's parking lot. There was a small, white delivery van parked near the loading dock. The keys were usually kept in a magnetic box under the wheel well, a common practice for the night shift. I dragged myself toward the van. Every movement was a struggle against the gravity of my own pain. I found the box. I found the keys. As I pulled myself into the driver's seat, I looked at the leather notebook on the passenger side. I flipped to the very last page. There was a list of coordinates, GPS locations. The last one on the list was labeled Final Archive. It wasn't Vance's house. It was a location in the woods, 5 miles north of the city. I started the engine. The van rumbled to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the pharmacy lot. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a part of the record, and I was going to make sure the ending was written in ink, not blood. The drive to the northern woods was a blur of red tail lights and the rhythmic wiping of the windshield. A light rain had started to fall, turning the dust on the road into a slick, gray film. My shoulder was screaming. My leg was numb, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I kept seeing that signature, a Vance. The coordinates led me to an old, unmarked gravel road that wound deep into the pine forest. This wasn't where rich men lived. This was where things were hidden. At the end of the road stood a concrete bunker. No windows, no signs, just a heavy steel door with a keypad. I recognized the architecture. It was the same style as the basement levels of the city archives. This was Vance's private Sexter 7G, his personal vault of leverage. I pulled the van to a stop and stepped out into the rain. The air was cold and smelled of pine needles and wet earth. The steel door was slightly ajar. He was already here. I grabbed the iron jack handle from the van floor and stepped toward the bunker. The silence of the woods was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of water from the trees. I pushed the door open. Inside, a long concrete ramp led down into the earth. The air was dry and smelled of ozone, the familiar scent of high-end air filtration systems used for document preservation. I walked down the ramp, my boots echoing against the walls. At the bottom, the space opened up into a massive room filled with rows of metal shelves. Thousands of boxes, thousands of lives, condensed into paper and tucked away in the dark. And in the center of the room, under a single, harsh halogen light, stood Arthur Vance. He wasn't the man I remembered. He wasn't wearing his expensive suit. He was in a simple gray sweater, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. He was holding a flare gun, and across from him, standing in the shadows of the shelves, was Elias. The gauze on Elias's face was almost entirely red now. He looked like a flayed man, a specter of raw muscle and white bone. He wasn't holding the bolt cutters anymore. He was holding a stack of yellowed papers, the original deeds. "I gave you everything, Elias." Vance shouted, his voice echoing in the bunker. "I kept the records. I kept the proof. I was your insurance. You kept them. For yourself." Elias's voice was a low, guttural rasp. You didn't save me. You saved the weapon. Elias held up the papers. 10 years. I was a ghost. 10 years. I didn't exist because you needed to wait for the right price. I stepped into the light. Vance, I yelled. Both men turned toward me. Vance looked relieved for a split second. Then his eyes went cold. You shouldn't have come here, Vance said, the flare gun trembling in his hand. This was supposed to be a clean audit, a final deletion. I looked at the shelves around me. I realized then that I wasn't the only auditor on the list. This bunker was full of the mistakes of the city, and Vance was the one who managed the silence. The list in the notebook. Vance, I said, taking a step forward. The auditors. You didn't just hire us to scan files. You hired us to find the ones that needed to disappear, and then you hired Elias to make US disappear. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Elias wasn't a rogue killer. He was Vance's janitor, a man so broken and desperate that he had been convinced that killing the auditors was the only way to clean his own record. Vance had promised him a new life, a new identity, a restoration of his record. But it was all a lie. He's not going to fix your file, Elias, I said, looking at the man in the bandages. Look at the last page of the notebook. Look at the entry for tonight. Elias slowly turned the page of the leather book he still carried. I saw his shoulders slump. On the last page, under my name, was one more entry. Elias Thorne. Status, permanent redaction. Vance didn't wait. He pulled the trigger on the flare gun. The room exploded in a blinding, white-hot light. The flare hit the stack of papers in Elias's hand, igniting them instantly. The dry, 100-year-old parchment went up like tinder, the flames licking at the gauze on Elias's arms. Elias didn't scream. He didn't even try to put the fire out. He just watched the record burn. The proof of his house, his life, his parents. It was turning into gray ash in his palms. No, Vance screamed, lunging forward to grab the burning papers. The deeds, the leverage. But Elias was faster. Even with his shattered jaw and his burning skin, he moved with a final, desperate strength. He wrapped his arms around Vance, pinning the man's arms to his sides. The fire spread from the papers to Elias's tracksuit, then to Vance's sweater. We are the record, Elias whispered, his voice clear for the first time. And we are being closed. I lunged forward, trying to reach them, but the heat was too intense. The air in the bunker was being sucked into the fire, and the smell of burning paper and chemicals filled my lungs. Vance was screaming now, a high-pitched, pathetic sound that was drowned out by the roar of the fire. The shells caught next. Thousands of boxes, filled with the secrets of the city, began to ignite. The final archive was turning into a furnace. I saw Elias look at me through the flames. He didn't look like a monster anymore. He looked like a man who was finally, mercifully, being forgotten. He nodded once. I turned and ran. I scrambled up the concrete ramp, the heat at my back pushing me forward. I burst through the steel door and collapsed onto the wet grass of the woods. I didn't stop. I dragged myself to the van and started the engine. As I drove away, I saw a plume of thick, black smoke rising from the trees. There was no explosion, just a quiet, steady consumption of the past. I stopped at a gas station 10 miles away. I walked into the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My face was covered in soot. My cheek was sliced open. My eyes were bloodshot and hollow. I looked like a record that had survived a fire. I reached into my pocket and felt the leather notebook. I had dropped in the bunker, or so I thought, but I felt something else. I pulled it out. It was a single, charred piece of paper. The only thing I had managed to grab before the fire took everything. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a signature. It was a photo of a young Elias Thorne standing in front of his house. The back was burned away, leaving only the image of his smile. I walked out to the van and sat in the silence of the dawn. The city archives would open in 3 hours. My replacement would sit at my desk. They would log into the system. They would see a Sector 7G that was now empty. I opened a notebook to the first page. I didn't have a pen, so I used a piece of charcoal from my burnt jacket. I wrote my own name, and beside it I wrote, Survivor. Then, I closed the book and threw it into the trash can next to the pump. The story was over. The record was balanced. And for the first time in my life, I was okay with being forgotten.